Okay, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you are watching this video lecture. Okay, probably good to have Netherland handy to follow along, and the Smith article if possible. I'm going to just start this hopefully brief argument about Netherland with a quote from Henry James, who wrote, "It seems probable that if we were never bewildered, there would never be a story to tell about us. We should partake of the superior nature of the all-knowing immortals, whose annals are dreadfully dull, so long as flurried humans are not, for the positive relief of bored Olympians mixed up with them." In this view, storytelling does not eliminate bewilderment, make the world utterly intelligible, but it is a response to the condition of bewilderment. And I think this is very much in keeping with the way I read Netherland. But I think Netherland is especially preoccupied with this condition of existential bewilderment, and I want to argue about the particular bewilderment that occurs when we confront and assimilate certain postmodern truisms. Postmodern truisms, already we can see that this novel places us in paradoxical positions. What happens when we discover that the narratives we make of our lives are fictions, that they are trite and intertextual, that they are cobbled out of other narratives? And what happens when we discover that we have no essential, authentic identities, that it is not just our subjectivities that are constructs, but also any objective truth, any sense of reality, the idea that reality is some substance out there, or the idea that reality is not some substance out there, but is simply the result of language and narratives that construct it. What are we left to do when we've confronted these postmodern truths? What are we left with besides chaos? So I think Netherland is very aware about the conflict between the terrifying paradoxical knowledge that there is very aware and very much about the terrifying paradoxical knowledge that there is no knowledge. Likewise, that there's no coherent self, narrative, history, authenticity, and yet this story is one that I think expresses a longing for that narrative, the ability to make sense of oneself and the world. More than just about the longing for that, for an authentic self, and the ability to make sense, I think it shows how the rejection of any coherent self and the rejection of the attempt to make sense of the world or of the notion that there is a reality, it shows that these rejections are personally and politically disabling, and thus that though reality and the self may be constructed, and so in a sense are fictions, they may be necessary sustaining fictions in order to ground any action, be it interpersonal communication or political action. I'm going to start this by taking issue with a couple of Zadie Smith's points, in part as a point of just departure, in part because I think she gives a good example of how really to misuse quotes taken out of context, in part because I want to set the precedent and example for you that we don't necessarily read theorists or critics to agree with them. Often they give us good ways of accessing central issues, even if we actually disagree with their take on those issues. But that said, as in a critical essay argument, I won't just play ping pong with and have a counterpoint with Smith throughout. This is just going to be a way of jumping off and engaging with what I think are central issues in the text. But it's not going to be this is not really a matter of quarreling with Smith, but of making my own argument about what I think this novel is doing. Okay, but Smith does write that Netherland is committed to the representation of authentic subjectivity. On page 9, if you've reader viewed this piece, she writes, the paragraph begins, "In Netherland, only one's own subjectivity is really authentic, and only the personal offers this possibility of transcendence, this, quote, translation into another world," which she, again, takes out of context. But which is why personal things are so relentlessly aestheticized. This is how their importance is signified and their depth. The world is covered in language. Lip service is paid to the sanctity of mystery. quote, one result of growing up in Holland was a sense that mystery is treasurable, even necessary, for mystery in such a crowded, see-through little country is, among other things, space. But in practice, Netherlands colonizes all space by the way of voracious image. I just want to say, though, that, she poses this as lip service paid to the sanctity of mystery, whereas I think Netherland, by contrast, portrays the entire world as extremely mysterious, and it was only Hans's youth growing up in Netherland where he thought that mystery was more or less absent. His state in this novel is one of actually being completely overwhelmed by the mysteriousness, unreality, vagueness, phantasmagoric quality of the world. So I don't think that this book is one that only pays lip service to mystery. But Smith writes, in practice, Netherland colonizes all space by way of voracious image. Nothing escapes. I've skipped a little bit there. On TV, quote, dark Baghdad glitters with American bombs. Again, this is a voracious image, but I think taken out of context. And then she writes, even the many traumas of middle-class life are given the high lyrical treatment in what feels, at its best, like a grim satire on the profound fatuity of 21st century bourgeois existence. The surprise discovery of his wife's lactose intolerance becomes, quote, an unknown hinterland to our marriage. Okay, again, I think this is a quote taken out of context, that the lactose intolerance is the hinterland in their marriage. And we're going to look at some of these passages in context, but I encourage you to look at almost all of them. Just want to skip to one more point that that Smith makes along these similar lines. On page 12, she writes, where? I'm sorry, bottom of 11. Netherland, at the bottom of the page, last sentence, recognizes the tenuous nature of a self, that, quote, fine white thread running through years and years. By the way, that's not a self, but cricket in the text. And Hans flirts with the possibility that language may not precisely describe the world. I was assaulted by the notion, arriving in the form of a terrifying stroke of consciousness, that substance, everything of so-called concreteness, was indistinct from its unnameable opposite. But in the end, Netherland always wants to comfort us, to assure us of our beautiful plenitude. I don't think that's true, actually, at all of this novel. She then talks about sort of anti-novels or anti-sublimes in which we see no self at all. And then at the bottom of that page, she writes, Netherland doesn't really want to know about misapprehension. It wants to offer us the authentic story of a self. But is this really what having a self feels like? Do selves always seek their good in the end? Are they never perverse? Do they always want meaning? Do they not sometimes want its opposite? Well, I do actually think that this novel is about a self who wants some meaning, or about somebody who wants to be a self, but I don't actually think that this book wants to offer us the authentic story of a self. It, in fact, I think is about the fact that there is no authentic self, and yet somebody who wants to be a self. I hope that distinction will become a little bit more clear throughout. Let me maybe just try to reiterate that what I think this novel is about, or what I think where Smith sees a novel that recognizes authenticity for what it is, but that goes on with trying to render an authentic self anyway. I see a novel that's about the knowledge that there is no authentic self or a stable and coherent reality, but that questions where that leaves us, and in fact depicts the workings of a person who knows that there is no authentic self and has no authentic self, and yet this knowledge poses a problem. What to do with yourself if you don't have a self? It could be a title for this essay. Okay, I'm going to go through a bunch of examples here, some in just order of the text, that point to where this book undermines, I think, the notion of either a stable reality or a stable biography, a stable self. One moment, climactic, or not a climactic moment, but a dramatic early moment comes on page 13 when a gunman shows up on their cricket field. The second to last paragraph begins, but in some sense paralyzed by this unreal, dawdling gunman, I stayed where I was, tightly gripping my gun and more maestro bat. And then in the next paragraph, as for Chucky, he now stood alone, except for me, that is. I stood a few yards away. This required no courage on my part because I felt nothing. I experienced the occasion as a kind of emptiness. Okay, so on the one hand, the gunman is unreal. He's one of many sort of ghostly apparitions in the novel where Smith again sees like the naked man running through the woods on the side of the train as perhaps loaded with significance. I see quite the opposite. This is some ghostly apparition or some presence without any explicability. Here, similarly, this gunman is unreal, and Hans's response to the gunman, it's not fear, it's not self-reflection, it's a kind of emptiness. I think this book does a lot to sort of empty out Hans's self. The central interpersonal conflict, which of course is central to the plot of the novel and a big point of contention for Smith, is the conflict between Hans and his wife, the troubled marriage. But we're alerted to the fact very on that we know that this story, the story of a troubled marriage, is more or less a trite one. On top of page 23, we get what the two of them feel is above all tired. And the last lines of that first paragraph on 23, a banal state of affairs, yes, but our problems were banal, the stuff of women's magazines. All lives, I remember thinking, eventually funnel into the advice columns of women's magazines. Now, sexist as this may be, I think the clear point is that women's magazines here are trite, are hackneyed, are somewhat sentimental, and that the stuff of their story is just that same stuff. They are not unique. It is utterly banal. We looked at the lines later on that same page, the second to last paragraph, last full paragraph. Much of the subsequent days and nights was spent in an agony of emotions and options and discussions. It is truly a terrible thing when questions of love and family and home are not answerable. Well, this comes sounding almost like a cliche. It is truly a terrible thing. When questions of love and home are no longer answerable. But I think this cliche is the paradoxical cliche of the postmodern. When questions are no longer answerable, when there are no answers, there is no way of combating these problems, it is truly a terrible thing. I think this is the problem that much of this novel wrestles with. When we realize that there are no answers, there are no resolutions, it may be true, but it's a terrible thing. I want to just look at the next. We'll come back to the next paragraph. I do want to look at the next paragraph, and the reason I probably shouldn't is because I want to stress that I don't think you should make your arguments in writing an essay in sort of chronological order, but for ease of this lecture, I'm going to just do so and address something that's on this page. But this should probably be in a different portion because it's not about the personal affairs of them, but about public affairs. But similarly, sort of reality that confronts Hans and Rachel post 9/11 also is one of complete inexplicability without any answers. They talk about the problem of Indian Point, and they were constantly being informed that radioactive debris, whatever this might be, was liable to rain down on us. Flipping over to 24. Indian Point, the earliest, most incurable apprehension stirred in its very name. Then there's a question of dirty bombs. Apparently any fool could build a dirty bomb and explode it in Manhattan. How likely was this? Nobody knew. Very little about anything seemed intelligible or certain, and New York itself, that ideal source of the metropolitan diversion that serves as a response to the largest futilities, took on a fearsome, monstrous nature whose reality might have befuddled Plato himself. We were trying, as I irrelevantly analyzed it, to avoid what might be termed a historic mistake. We were trying to understand, that is, whether we were in a pre-apocalyptic situation like the European Jews in the 30s or the last citizens of Pompeii, or whether our situation was merely near apocalyptic, like that of Cold War inhabitants of New York, London, Washington, and for that matter, Moscow. And then he phones Rachel's father and says he wanted to believe that the episode of history that was the Cold War had suited its survivors with special information. Okay, again, knowledge here is not possible. There is nobody knew how likely a dirty bomb attack was. There's, by the way, a gesture and mention to New York itself as a source of the metropolitan diversion. That's a response to the largest futilities, building and construction in this in this novel, as I think many places is seen as a kind of combat of chaos and structure versus order. But New York itself takes on a nature that is fearsome, monstrous, and its reality is befuddling to even Plato. Moreover, they cannot understand their situation, and there's no special information forthcoming about it. Okay, the world, it doesn't seem to me here much about this world is intelligible or certain. Okay. Likewise, we've looked at the passage that discusses the difficulty of communication, and I think this novel confronts frustration with languages misfiring or malfunctioning. And that's the passage at the top of 30 where Hans thinks that he should tell Rachel he loves her, that he needed her, that he would cut back on work, all these things, cliches, that he was a family man. And then he says, I felt shame. I see this clearly now at the instinctive recognition in myself of an awful, enfeebling fatalism, a sense that the great outcomes were but randomly connected to our endeavors, that life was beyond mending, that love was lost, that nothing was worth saying was sayable, that dullness was general, that disintegration was irresistible. Here, I think, is the enfeebling attitude or posture that Netherland sets before us. I think O'Neill stresses this, that these feelings that great outcomes are beyond, are randomly connected to our endeavors, that life was beyond mending. Okay, that sort of nothing worth saying is sayable. That communication is impossible. That action is impossible to affect the world. These feelings, these enfeebling feelings, are actually only shameful and stagnating. We get this the comment right after that life itself had been disembodied. My family, the spine of my days, had crumbled. I was lost in invertebrate time. And there's a kind of mixing of metaphors there between the disembodied nature of life, the spine of days having crumbled. Here, the spine is the connective tissue, but it's also it's the time connective tissue. It's a chronology. And this novel, I think, shows life narratives and historical narratives alike as invertebrate, as lacking connective tissue or a spine. We might also notice, again, the paradox that structures this novel, the paradox that we get when Hans says, I felt shame, I see this clearly now. Here is some knowledge, but what his knowledge is that is that he has this fatalism. So this is kind of a paradox, I think, that structures this novel. That knowing that it's telling a story that is about the impossibility of telling a story, or telling a true story. It's using language to make sense and gain knowledge of the fact that knowledge may be unattainable. Lots of examples here. But maybe just turn to another point that Smith references. Well, sorry, I'll have to skip this next example. I apologize about that, because I can't find it. We get a number of images of Hans and his son Jake. One where he's pushing Jake on swings on page 40. And Jake keeps saying, higher, higher. That middle paragraph on the 40, Jake repeated higher every time he swung up to my hand, and for a while his was the only voice among us. His happiness on the swing was about the relief of communication as much as anything. He cleanly uttered his wish, and cleanly it was granted. This is in sharp contrast to the incapability that Rachel and Hans have. I'm still looking for that other quote, but I will skip it. Okay. Again, rather than an authentic self, I think Netherland poses Hans as someone who has very little continuity in his life narrative. On page 49, that first full paragraph begins, some people have no difficulty in identifying with their younger incarnations. Rachel, for example, will refer to episodes from her childhood or college days as if they'd happened to her that very morning. I, however, seem given to self-estrangement. There are many, many examples of Hans describing his younger self in the third person in this novel. On page 81 and 82. Right at the bottom of 81, he says, for 6 weeks during my incarnation as a 17-year-old in need of money, I cycled to Monster at 5 in the morning. Hear the words incarnation. My incarnation as a 17-year-old, I think O'Neill conveys in these words the idea that Hans has had several different existences within his life. On the top of 82, he says, that boy making his way along the edge of dunes. Here's a sort of self-alienation or division. Others get the same sense on 85. When his mother has died, Hans's mother has died, The last full paragraph in 85. In the months that followed, my grief became disturbed by a guilty sense that very little had changed. With the passage of time, Mama was barely less present than she'd been during the years in which, separated by an airplane journey, we'd spoke once or twice a month on the telephone and seen each other a week or two in a year. The last sentence of that paragraph. But soon a still more disquieting idea took possession of my thoughts, namely that my mother had long ago become an imaginary being of sorts. Okay, here other people, living or dead, are imaginary. They're, we might say, constituted by our thoughts about them. When he actually is confronted, flashes back to her presence, he doesn't recognize her, or her actuality seems unsatisfactory. Her embodied presence. Similarly, Hans suspects that his own actuality destroyed her impression of him. That's on 86. Again, we have the sort of fallibility of memory and the sort of division, self-division, depicted on 87, the next page, where Hans is standing at his childhood window. He says, the lighthouse had been mesmeric to my boy self. He was an only child, and it must be that at night he habitually stood at his bedroom window alone. But my recollection of watching the light travel out of Scheveningen contained the figure of my mother at my side, helping me to look out in the dark. You know, here we have this self-division. He was an only child, and at night he habitually stood at his bed. And also O'Neill conveys the fallibility of memory. Hans reasons that he must have been watching out his window alone, but that in his memory it contains the mother at his side, as if wishfully. On page 88, right at the top, he thinks about he's still thinking about his younger self, and he says, the dunes, the ashen flow of night clouds, the returning ray of light, the exclusive barony granted by this viewpoint, even the little baron himself and his wonderment, none were any longer in my possession. But if not these things, the question expressed itself as a movement of emotion, then what things? Okay. This exclusive view, the Baron himself, which is Hans's childhood self, and his wonderment, his feelings, are no longer in Hans's possession. If these things are not in his possession, what things? Okay. Here again, I think is centrally is the central tension that I'm trying to argue this novel expresses. Okay. The novel is quite aware that there is no self, or that the self is only kind of constituted by a narrative about the self, right? And that knowledge produces the recognition that this younger child is no longer Hans's possession. That's no longer, even in a sense, him. But if these things aren't his possessions, his own memories, his own younger self, then what is? Where are we from there? I think the other really important part of this passage is what's between the hyphens. The question expressed itself as a movement of emotion. This sort of longing for a self, this fear, or what do I have if I don't have a self, expresses itself as a movement of emotion. I think here we get a foregrounding of the fact that these thoughts, a kind of moment of self-reflexivity, where the novel kind of addresses that thoughts that novel renders do not actually happen necessarily in language, that they may happen as, or questions may express themselves just as emotions, and are later rendered into questions. I think this is something that post-structuralism largely has difficulty reckoning with, that there may be some kind of conscious response that works in emotion, that works in image, that is nonetheless an expression of feeling that is not actually articulated in language. For example, do we only know hunger through our terms, hunger, or do we know hunger through the feeling that is hunger? Throughout the novel, really, all sorts of coherent narratives and accounts of the world are rendered uncertain, not just the self. Um, on page 51, we get a little vignette of Hans's friend Vinay, who is the food writer. He's kind of a street foodie, and 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 Vinay uh, writes is from Bangalore, but he writes about all kinds of ethnic food restaurants, and he says right at the top of 51, one night it's Cantonese, then it's Georgian, then it's Indonesian, then Syrian. I mean, I think this shit is good baklava, but what the fuck do I know, really? How can I be sure? Then the important line. Yet when he wrote, Vinay exuded bright certainty and expertise. As I repeatedly went forth with him and began to understand the ignorance and contradictions and language difficulties with which he contended, and the doubtful sources of his information, the seemingly bottomless history and darkness out of which dishes of New York emerged, the deeper grew my suspicion that his work finally consisted of minting or perpetuating, and in any event circulating misconceptions about his subject, and in this way adding to the endless perplexity of the world. Well, this is not just Vinay's problem, but Hans starts to doubt his own work, and on page 52, the middle of that last paragraph, by the fall of 2002, even my work had become too small to contain my misery. It forcefully struck me as a masquerade, this endless business of churning out research papers, of blast voicemailing clients, etc., of constantly tending to my popularity and perceived competence. I felt like Vinay cooking up myths from scraps and peels of facts. Okay, both of these people who are supposed experts, and Hans is described even as something of a guru, are revealed to be fraudulent and are and are actually adding to the quote endless perplexity of the world with their mythic accounts of it. It's not coincidental, by the way, that right after this, Vinay and Hans end up going to get some food, and on Vinay's theory that cab drivers have a special knowledge of good places to eat. On 53, the first full paragraph, the theory apparently was that here you had a class of men familiar with alien foods who freely exercised their choices from a vast selection of establishments and had no stake in the bourgeois dining enterprise, men supposedly driven by unfeigned primitive cravings, men hungered for a true taste of homeland and mother's cooking, men who would, in short, lead one to the so-called real thing. Of course, I could not help thinking it simple, this theory of reality. Okay, this idea that cabs have authentic food knowledge, Hans is and the novel, I think, are suspicious of. So rather than, I think, rendering ethnic others as authenticity fetishes, as Smith says, I think this novel sees through claims to even ethnic authenticity. There in the restaurant on page 54, they run into Chuck Ramkissoon, who promptly tells Vinay and Hans about his kosher sushi business. What could be less authentic than a Trinidadian with a kosher sushi business? One can go on and on, I think, where this book shoots holes in authentic narratives. There's a moment where Hans sleeps with another woman named Danielle, and he's completely bored by what she tells him of his what she tells him of her life. At the bottom of 109, Hans says, "I was no longer vulnerable to curiosity's enormous momentum. I had nothing new to murmur on to another on the subject of myself, not the smallest eagerness about being briefed on Danielle's supposedly unique trajectory, the curve described on the action one could safely guess of the usual material and maternal and soulful longings, a few thwarting tics of character, and good and bad, and luck good and bad. A life seemed like an old story." Here, the supposedly unique narrative is revealed to be completely trite and not unique at all, composed of the usual things. A life seemed like an old story. Um, um, that said, there seems like a moment when he suddenly recognizes Danielle's uniqueness as they start to touch one another and have sex. While this looks like it might be a moment of communion with somebody else's uniqueness, what it actually reveals is Hans's own lack of identity. On page 114, right at the top of the page, her job as a visual creative, her habit of buying lingerie now struck me as treasurable. Our touching progressed to more purposeful, thrilling contact, and it was in the middle of this subjectively remarkable development, I was being kissed by a beautiful woman who wanted to kiss me, that I became conscious of a kind of vertigo. This vertigo is not caused by sudden contact, physical or with somebody's uniqueness, but instead it arose from the very completeness of my gladness, which was erasing, along with my wretchedness, everything attached to the wretchedness, which was everything of importance to the person I understood myself to be. Once long ago, an old university friend of mine, a gay man, confided to me that he had only barely survived a catastrophic depression brought about by a love affair with a woman, the effect of which had been to smash utterly the identity he had constructed at such a cost to himself and his parents. I was now in danger of clambering onto the same boat. I dizzily sensed my life to date being set at naught, either that or set on its head, since I was confronted with a turning upside down of my last decade, which very possibility I had completely misread, and whose true sweep it was now possible to conceive went from a forgotten London night in 1995 to a serendipitous winter's morning in New York 2003. This was perhaps an extreme reaction to my situation, but nonetheless it was my reaction, which I suppose puts me in the romantic camp, again, privileging one's own experience above others. But here, okay, the possibility that Hans has completely misread his life's narrative, or that his life's narrative is not the one he thought, a narrative of a disintegration of a marriage, but actually of a serendipitous meeting that is a reuniting with a woman he maybe is meant to be with or something, or will be with. These are two narratives in competition, the effect of both of which is to sort of, like the man he talks about, smashing the identity he had constructed at such a cost. This erasure of everything that was important to the person Hans understands himself to be is dizzying, is disorienting. So again, here I think we have acknowledgement that identity is completely a construct, and yet the loss of one's sense of who one is produces this dizzying vertigo. One could go on and on, but I'm going to skip ahead of just a little bit. This same lack of knowledge, not of the self but of the other, persists throughout, and on 126, Hans realizes he doesn't really know his wife. This is prompted by the knowledge that she is lactose intolerant, which is an undiscovered factor that he had not factored into his narrative of her. The first full paragraph on 126 begins, other what? I was too flabbergasted to sleep so far. As I was aware, the course of Rachel's life prior to its confluence with mine was almost fully comprehended by the facts set forth in her aptly named curriculum vitae, a private girls' school, a wander year in India, etc., etc. Hans then at the bottom of the page says, I'd assumed some unilateral failing of mine had been at the bottom of our downfall. Now it seemed that some malfunction of Rachel's might have also been operative. I concluded feverishly that here was a development, an unknown hinterland to our marriage, with which, if jointly and equally explored, might lead to discoveries that would change everything. And the prospect filled me with a theorist, lunatic excitement in those daydreams of room service and afternoons, gabbling blackberries and pineapple slices while we navigated the uncharted reaches of our psyches. Okay. So again, here I think the hinterland is not so much lactose intolerance, but the knowledge that someone else is completely more complicated and different than one's pre-existing narrative of that person, their CV, if you will. Okay. One, I think, significant moment that Smith gets right, but sort of gets the import of wrong, it comes on 95, where Hans, right before the end of the first paragraph, right before the first full paragraph, is assaulted by a notion arriving in a terrifying stroke of consciousness. That substance, everything of so-called concreteness, was indistinct from its unnameable opposite. Okay, here is the really dizzying, terrifying notion that everything that you think is concrete, is real, is no different than fiction, is no distinct from indistinct from nothingness, perhaps. And then, though, we get the lines that Smith, of course, ignores. Kicking a rock or patting a dog is, I suppose, enough to rid most people of this variety of bewilderment, which must be as ancient as our species. But I didn't have a rock or dog to hand. I had nothing to hand, nothing but the glass of a window under assault from a storm. It came as a reprieve to hear the infuriating cheep of the telephone. So, rather than say that this book, I think, turns away from these moments of suspicion that reality is unreal, I think it's very much about someone who's confronting that awareness. I think it's quite important, and it's really the hinge in my mini argument here today, that when the phone rings and sort of reality intervenes, it is Rachel on the telephone talking about a huge anti-war rally protesting the impending invasion of Iraq, and of course the spurious notion that they harbor weapons of mass destruction. Political reality is, I think, announced here by the novel in its very structure as part of the problem with the notion that there is no reality out there. Okay, denying that reality, concreteness, is any different than its opposite, ignores reality. Of course, this novel doesn't want to let one ignore reality, and I think this is one of the other reasons, besides the fact that having a self is not, or lacking a self is not very satisfying personally. Similarly, I think this novel suggests that lacking, or that the idea of that there is no stable reality is politically what's the word I'm looking for? It causes political paralysis. I think it's significant also that the terms in which Rachel describes her rage at the United States, at the bottom of that same page on 95, she says she doesn't want to expose Jake to a, quote, mentally ill, sick, unreal country whose masses and leaders suffered from extraordinary and self-righteous delusions about the United States, the world, and indeed, thanks to the influence of the fanatical evangelical Christian movement, the universe. Delusions that had the effect of exempting the United States from the very rules of civilized and lawful and rational behavior it so mercilessly sought to enforce on others. Well, here Rachel's sense is that the reality of the situation is that the United States is completely unable to confront reality. It is possessed by delusions of righteousness. One couldn't really criticize the U.S.'s actions as wrong, or as sort of delusional, without some notion of a stable reality. But I think more importantly, if the critique of realism is that realism's complicity with Enlightenment has enabled the West to impose its version of reality on the rest of the world, and that its insistence on its own rationality, this is the West's rationality and morality and law and order, has been used to exploit and dominate others, and violating, of course, this reason and morality and law and order in the process. Here is a more or less realistic novel that is critiquing the United States for doing just those things. Hans's answer to Rachel's arguments about the United States and its immoral, illegal, imperialist war is another of his sort of flights of reverie and his memories of flying, and is the translation to another world passage that Smith cites, which is on 97. The middle paragraph, if your point is that the U.S. should not attack Iraq, I managed, and then he trails off at a substantive loss. Here I think the word choice is important here. He's at a loss of substance as well as at a substantial loss. I was distracted too by a memory of Rachel and me flying to Hong Kong for our honeymoon, and how in the dimmed cabin I looked out of my window and saw lights in small glimmering webs on the placeless darkness miles below. I pointed them out. Placeless darkness, I think is important. I pointed them out to Rachel. I wanted to say something about these creaturely cosmical glows, which made me feel I wanted to say, as if we had been removed by translation into another world. Rachel, the rationalist in this book, leaned across me and looked down to the earth. It's Iraq, she said. Well, Hans here remembers this moment, which is a moment where he has been reading these lights as small glimmering webs, of reading them as placeless darkness miles and as creaturely cosmical glows. And Rachel says, no, it's Iraq, it's a place. Okay. Needless to say, Hans cannot form an opinion on the war in Iraq. He is possessed by paralysis on 99. He has no opinion on the war. He is, quote, unable to contribute, also on 99, to conversations. And on 100, it's because he, quote, lacks necessary powers of perception and certainty. Okay. Here, Hans's inability to know the world. He doesn't know all the information, and even if he did, he would be unable to predict the future, is a justification for him to not take any kind of political stance. I'm just going to look at two more moments quickly. One on 121 to 122, and Hans has been watching a guy in his neighborhood fly fish into 23rd Street. On page 122, there's a catalog of springtime developments. And right at the bottom of that first paragraph on 122, We get that a dog, headless dog washed up near the Throgs Neck Bridge. On television, dark Baghdad glittered with American bombs. And again, Smith cites this as an example of everything colonized with a veracious image. Right after dark Baghdad glittered with American bombs, we get the war started, baseball season came into view. The war and the bombs are listed in a long catalog of other springtime developments. So I think O'Neill places this in this offhand way in a list of other things to show how this is just the opposite of making beautiful the war. It's in fact making it just like everything else. The bombs are rendered no different from March Madness or a missing Cocker Spaniel. I think if things are just left to be things, then war is no different from any other seasonal phenomenon, O'Neill wants to suggest. Finally, I want to suggest that rather than a place of authenticity, a last bastion of authenticity, ethnic identity works somewhat differently in this novel than Smith suggests. And I think this is also less, again, to quarrel with Smith than to talk about how this novel thinks. I think realism is a way of actually addressing needed social realities, that it's both aware of the problems with constructing reality, but to fail to do so is to be unable to sort of critique and talk about what the world is like. And I want to talk about Chuck's plan, Chuck's cricket plan, which we first get introduced to as he's sort of pitching it to Hans on page 78 and 79. Not coincidentally, right as they drive past the World Trade Center site, which is now a, quote, great downtown vacancy. At the bottom of 78, I won't read it all. Chuck just catalogs the incredible demographic growth of West Indians and then of South Asians. And he says that these are a huge market for Chuck's cricket stadium and the TV rights. On page 80, he talks about TV and internet viewership of 70 million in India alone. 70 million, do you have any idea how much money this would bring in? Coca-Cola, Nike, they're all desperate to get at the South Asian market. Well, think about cricket for a moment. Cricket, we could think of as an emblem of imperialist cultural mixing. Cricket gets brought to places like India, the Caribbean, and South Africa by Europeans. It then gets taken up by the, quote, natives of those places, exported to the United States as the residents of those countries immigrate to the U.S. And then now provides a huge market for people like Chuck, enterprising immigrants, to exploit. I think this is a picture, a little miniature allegory of the way globalization really works, not as a preservation of authentic ethnic identities, but where there's constant mixing and hybridity. Cricket, the game of the Dutch, the game of the English, becomes the game of Pakistanis and Trinidadians, and then becomes a way of exploiting new global markets that, of course, the old corporate players like Coca-Cola and Nike will be eager to get at. One quick other thing is that I think this book also glances briefly at environmental issues, and that, not coincidentally, Chuck wants to name his field Bald Eagle Field. This just comes 2 pages later on page 82 to 83. Of course, a great symbol of America, and Chuck kind of goes through a bit of a reverie himself on the significance of the bald eagle. But at the top of 83, he says it's got scale, it makes it American, the name Bald Eagle Field. But also, he wants to pay homage to the eagles and other birds, hummingbirds, heron's, that habitually use the nature preserve located in this strange parkland. An homage also to the hundreds of migrant species traveling through here on the Atlantic flyway. Well, we'll get another a lot about birds as a kind of emblem um, of the natural world that is under threat in Franzen's freedom. But I think it's quite significant that then in the next paragraph, O'Neill gives us Chuck's speech about how flat the cricket playing surface is, and he says to Hans, quote, "The first thing we did in the summer was kill everything with Roundup. We brought in a sod cutter to take out all the grass down to the roots, and then we flubbed it with the earth, etc." Okay, so right after this homage to the eagles, we get that they killed everything on the ground with Roundup. I think this again could be seen as a miniature of development and nascent capital endeavors, laying waste to natural resources, which they then kind of preserve in memory via a name. It's things like this that I think it's issues like this, globalization, global capital, exploitation of natural resources, that novels like Netherland don't want to let go of, and that Netherland itself poses as one of the problems with just kind of jettisoning the real, despite the fact that we know reality can only be constructed. So again, I don't think Netherland is an anxious novel so much as it's paradoxical. It uses realism's form, and it is aware of the critiques of realism, but I think it also thinks that to acknowledge the linguistic construction and hence tenuousness and imaginary qualities of the self, history, and reality does not mean we should, or perhaps more importantly, ever could abandon them. I'm just trying to say that again. I think Netherland is well aware of the critiques of realism. It's well aware and acknowledges, in fact, is really preoccupied by the fact that the self and reality are linguistically constructed, completely tenuous, in a way fictional or imaginary. But to acknowledge that the self or history or reality is linguistically constructed can lead to a kind of paralyzing self-consciousness or rather emptiness of the self, a kind of vacuousness. And so I think if one wants to be able to figure out how to act with one's interpersonal relations or to do meaningful political work in the world, one has to adhere to the things one knows to be flawed, i.e. language, narrative, a sense of that there is some reality. Okay, I appreciate you taking about an hour of your time to listen to this, and perhaps even more painfully to have to look at me some more. But I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this conversation, my lecture, and continuing the conversation on Netherland next Tuesday. And I will see you then.